afternoon. This is not going to be some magnificent treatise on Africa. So disabuse yourselves with that notion first of all. I'm simply going to be talking to you briefly about a few things African and Caribbean, connected of course by the slave trade, and things that I am in the process of discovering. I'm doing some work on the slave trade. I've done a lot of work on the discovery and settlement of water, and that has led me to look into the beginnings of the Trans-Caribbean slave trade, which we think has its origin somewhere in the evolution of cane as a commercial crop, sugar cane. But that did not start until roughly 1650. 1637 we had the first experimental sugar cane field being worked in Locust Hall at the behest of the Old Lips and Draxes. And the first known sugar plantation, of course, Drax Hall, which I suspect is the longest continuously owned single-family plantation. The Draxes are still owning Drax Hall, and the Drax generations have never ceased to come to Barbados at least once or twice a year. In fact, when I was doing the Hotel Symphony, I interviewed Mr. Drax at the time in Dorset, where they live. And I know he was not terribly pleased about developments in Barbados, but that's another story for another time. But the Draxes have been here from the beginning of sugar as a commercial crop. Sugar cane came to Barbados as early as 1627, April to be exact, when Henry Powell, who had brought the first group of settlers in February of 1627, dropped them off and went off to the Guyanas, as we call it generally, somewhere on the Amazon, to pick up a whole list of produce to bring back to Barbados to settle and cultivate what they call the plantation, singular. And he had a whole list, including fowls and tobacco and indigo, which was a plant for dye, and sugar canes and plantains, and I think there was quite an exhaustive list. So cane came early. Sugar cane, of course, had its origins in the East, and it came across, we suspect, by Columbus in the late 1400s to the West. So it's a gift, one of the best gifts that Columbus would have brought to the West. The second best gift, of course, that Columbus brought was that he did not discover Barbados. So we had cane in the Caribbean, we had cane in the Americas, but not in Barbados. So that was one of the products that came out in 1627. We suspect it was used as the energy drink of the day. Just peel it and suck it. Until around 1637, when Pete Brewer, Dutch Jew, came up and experimented on soils. And the hypothesis apparently was the depth of soil, which was not too much, generally speaking, above the rock, so that you needed to plant more of a grass than a root, deep-seated root crop. So across Barbados, because of that type of soil setup, it was considered more suitable to grasses. And so cane, the king of grass, became soon after that the king of Barbados, and eventually the gem in England's crown. Because by 1650, we are now seeing large swaths of Barbados being deforested, so that by 1670, 90% of the forest lands had gone. Just 10% of the original forests were left. Little dots and pieces like Turners Hall and a few other places. So the first people working the land, and these mainly are the hewers, the people who are chopping, are young English boys. And I said this morning that I plead for them, I cried for them. Because these are boys whose hands are soft. These are boys who are accustomed to the nice spring autumns and the cool winters when they're all indoors and playing card games and getting drunk in the pubs. And you snatch them up after spiking their liquor. And they wake up after being at sea for a couple of hours, wondering where the hell am I and why am I here? And when they asked the question, they were told, well, you're in the middle of the ocean, we are on our way to Barbados. You have two choices. You get on and walk back home, or you can go with us to Barbados. And I can't find any stories at all about any of them who walked back home. So they all came. And not only the boys, but later on the girls as well. In fact, for the first 10 years, we had nearly all men living in this community. First 2 years, the first 2-3 years, there were about 2,000 to 3,000 people living between the Oldtown settlement and then Bridgetown settlement. For sure, within 18 months, 14 had about 1,600 people on the island, cultivating from Sandy Lane down to Black Bess in the northeast. So these youngsters who are coming, most of them fed with this rich ale or whatever it is, and they come out. Some of them come as indentures. They painted a beautiful picture of this beautiful island where you don't have to worry about these harsh winters. So they come out for 7 years. Some of them have attached themselves to people to whom they owe money for a period of 5 to 7 years again as indentured servants. And they all come out and discover very quickly that the sun is different. There is no cold sun in Barbados. The sun is different. And so when sugar becomes a viable commercial commodity, they don't fit the bill. On the first boat that comes to Oldtown on February 17, 1627, there are 10 Africans. Nobody knows where they came from. All we know is that they were captured as a prize. We think quite benignly about these boats of Henry Powell and John Powell coming to Barbados as coming to settle, but all these fellas were armed to the teeth. They had guns on all of them, cannon to the right and cannon to the left. They were warships. And they met a Portuguese boat on the way out to Barbados, and they defeated it and took, I suspect they sank the boat, and they took the spoils of war. And that spoil included 10 Africans who were the first enslaved Africans, we believe, on Barbados. Now when I wrote my Oldtown book, I wrote an epitaph that it was as though they had never lived. Because there's no record of them at all. We have a record of the Amerindians because the Amerindians came back in the April voyage from the Guyana when Harry Powell brought up his sugar canes and so on. He says in one of his depositions, on my way down the river, these boats of Indians, he calls them, pursued us so that they could help us to plant the plantation for their fathers had told them about Barbados. And that's why we postulate that within the 20 or 30 years, a generation at least before. If you think of fathers as fathers one generation, but they may have been forefathers. But obviously these people knew about Barbados. So 32 Amerindians came on the second boat. 10 Africans came on the first boat. By the time the experiment of sugar has proved itself, by 1650 now we're having whole different set of things happening. The English labor is not so good. Can't deal with the climate. And so I suspect they have already used the Africans and realized that they have adapted. And so they use the slave trade that had already been in existence in the Caribbean. Because as early as 1562, I beg your pardon, this is many, many years before, I am seeing two stalwart Englishmen, two giants of English lore, John Hawkins and Sir Francis Drake, are bringing slaves in large numbers and selling them in mostly Spanish Caribbean, Santo Domingo and Puerto Rico, and sometimes in Santa Cruz, which later became St. Croix, Danish. Hawkins, by the way, and Drake are cousins, first cousins. Not well known. And both of them are to the manor born. I think both fathers were admirals in the English Navy. So they were blooded. And these two, in fact, Drake became so wealthy from the slave trade that he was able to equip his own fleet and defeat the Spanish Armada at no expense to Her Majesty, who, in thanks, went to the boatyard on board the Golden Hind and knighted him, Rise Sir Francis. And they knew that he was, of course, involved in slavery. And I mentioned that slavery, of course, in England was swept under the official carpets. In fact, there was no such thing as slavery in England. But let's go back. 1652. I was asked to take a look, 1562, I was asked to take a look at the Ivory Coast. But in the stuff I'm looking at these days, I'm not finding a lot of origin from the Ivory Coast. When I say a lot, that is, of course, vis-a-vis the rest of Africa. Africa is huge. I know that most Barbadians do not really consider the size of this vast continent and the diversity of this vast continent. But what I have been able to find in the last couple of months doing this research is that most of, now I'm talking about Eastern Caribbean mostly, although Barbados was the gateway for most of the slave trade from Africa to the Caribbean islands, most of the slaves came here and then were dispersed to some of the other islands. We have this huge, crazy notion about the worst being sent to Jamaica after the war, but that's crazy. But Barbados was in fact a gateway, but there were times when slaves went directly to Jamaica as well. But what I have found is that about 30% of the slaves who came out this way were from the Bight of Biafra, which in modern geography was in the Niger Delta, Gabon, Cameroon, and so on. I think these people would be equal. And just under that percentage would be the Gold Coast, which would be mostly the modern Ghana. Yeah? Akan people. And then after that, the Bites Inlet Bay, I suppose you would say, Bight of Benin, Slave Coast, Niger, Togo, mostly UA and Fon people. And then about 15 or less percent from Central Africa, Chad, the Republic of Congo and Gabon, Bantu and Congo people. And then a smaller, much smaller percentage from Senegambia. Senegal, Gambia, Mali, West Africa. And about the same small portion from the windward coast, which is Côte d'Ivoire. And we have one young lady whom we just met, I believe.
Yes.
You're from there.
I grew up in there.
You grew up?
In Abidjan. My dad is from Togo.
Very good. But strangely enough, this coast was also known as in French, the Côte des Dents, the tooth coast. Teeth, of course, I believe, referring to the tusk, the ivory tusks. And I want to make, just let me finish this first. The smallest group coming out of Sierra Leone between Guinea and Liberia must have been about 3 or 4%. So the Ivory Coast is not, during the most of the time of the transatlantic slave trade, it's not a huge contributor to the slaves who came up here. But I want to make this point. What I'm finding is that we are thinking of modern day Africa. And we need not, or we must not always do that in considering origins. Because things are happening, and we're discovering that, for instance, new methodology being used, including different methods of tracing your genealogy. And of course, now very prominent is the DNA. And I recently spoke to a young lady who's discovered that her ancestry is from Madagascar. Now, if you know Africa, not only on the far side, but it's on the far downside. And Madagascar was, I think, during the 17th and 18th century, the Portuguese might have come in the 18th century. But it's a very long, long way from the Caribbean and the Americas. So we tend to think in terms of the modern areas as such. But just consider this, that you have people who have come up to the Caribbean as slaves, who will tell you how many months they were marched across Africa. So it would not be unusual to have somebody from Kenya brought across the continent. And remember that slavery is not a novelty in the 17th century. It had been going on before. Not on this scale, of course. And it was a weapon, just as rape is still used as a weapon. Slavery was used, you took your enemies and you put them into captivity and they worked for you. The only thing is that with the transatlantic slave trade, they found that they could make money from these slaves by selling them. And that's what perpetuated, first of all, the idea of capturing people. So it's a mistake to think only of the western coast of Africa as the source points for slaves. And I would beg you to look at a couple of things. Hilary Beckles has done some work looking at the first slave society, 1636 to 1876. A woman called Suzanne Swartz, reconstructing the lives of liberated Africans. And she's looked at Sierra Leone in the 19th century. I've had the good pleasure of meeting a man called Edwin Barclay. The name Barclay rings a bell in Barbados because the Barclay family left Barbados just after emancipation and went back to Africa. Many of them became revered people between Sierra Leone, chief justices and so on, between Sierra Leone and Liberia. I met Edwin Barclay at church one Sunday morning last year. He'd come back to Barbados, he's now living in the States. Incidentally, at that same time, we were just completing this book, talking about the Barclays, without having, this is a novel by the way, and I could see for the first time who the Barclays were, what they looked like. They were mulattoes, they were African people who had been transported to the Caribbean, and for some unknown reason, whatever it was, they were part of the group that went up on the Cora. 376 or so people who left Barbados on the boat called the Cora. Went back to Africa. I think it had to do partly with the Caribbean, the UNIA and so on. So there are people who have done studies, there are people who have gone there, and I want to commend those books, Schwartz and Beckles, first of all, and Alvin Thompson. Professor Thompson, who I think people get afraid of him because they think that when he's writing, he's too graphic. But when you pick up when you turn on your CNN on mornings at breakfast and they have the gory scenes, they tell you, we wanted the following scene like graphic. But slavery is graphic. Slavery was not sweet. It was a graphic, a hellish situation people had to live through. A brutish beast it was. So if you're coming in to look at slavery, expect the best, expect the worst. So don't expect that Alvin Thompson is going to hide in visualizing slavery. He's going to show you the tools, the neck braces, and all the paraphernalia. His other book, Flight of Freedom, it's the same. And my friend Trevor Marshall has just published a piece called African Holocaust, African Influences on Barbadian Culture. Required reading. It's if you Google it, you'll find it. And then Archaeology House, Cameron Monroe, Power and Landscapes in the Atlantic, 2004, and Philippe Lavecherie, et al., Ome Creamy, Zangalo and Holt on the Iron Front. A lot of stuff is up there, which you can avail yourselves and dive into. But my main point today is that we need not try too hard, except you're looking for your own ancestry. We need not try too hard to isolate the individual spaces from which our forefathers came, because Africa is vast. It was then as it is now. And as I mentioned to you, the numbers again of slaves which we had. When I first started doing this paper, you were hearing about millions between Barbados and Brazil. Two entry points: Brazil in the south and Barbados for the north. And that figure as often as I go back to it, it seems to be getting smaller and smaller. Not bigger. 15 million starting line. It's getting smaller. Because you got this grand gross figure, and then when you try to pin it down, you're not seeing those numbers, that grand amount. In fact, when we thought that, in terms of money, when we thought that Hawkins and Dredd have been doing so many trips, I can now only find 4 or 5 trips for Hawkins. Between 1562 and 1566 or 65. Don't forget, a trip to Africa and back is a long way. You didn't go and sail that way. You had to sail around up to England, down the coast, and then you came down from Africa. It was at least 6 weeks coming across from Africa, and probably much longer going up to England, going up to North America to take the Gulf Stream to take you across to England. This is the days of sail we talk. So our numbers, I think, our initial numbers were inflated. 2 other things will come to mind, and you're going to be asking me the question, but how many slaves did it take to run the plantations in Barbados? And you look back at the census figures, because Barbados was quite adept at doing their census, and their census always included the amount of slaves they had on the plantations. And it seems to me that the figures on Barbados, if you use Barbados as a central point, the figures on Barbados seem to have been well done. When I say well, I mean efficiently done. And so the population of Barbados through the years does not seem to have been off kilter. So that when we reach 200,000 around the year 1900, you're looking at a proper figure. Now, the other thing that will throw that off is the life expectancy of the slave, the average slave in the fields. And that in the late 17th and early 18th century was 8 years. After 8 years, you qualified for old age pension or sickness benefits. Of course, there was none. So that's why I say that slavery was a British business. Because if you work for 8 years, and you're working from sun up to sundown, with breakfast, you go to work without breakfast. You get a breakfast at 9 o'clock, which is after you've done but in 3 hours. In today's pace, that would be a day's work already. And then you can get a break at 1 o'clock for lunch. 1 hour, and you go back to work until the sun goes down. So this back-breaking stuff goes on for, by 8 years, generally speaking, you are finished and you are replaceable and replaced. So this is where the numbers will go. But in no census can you see this spike, a natural spike. So I suspect that the numbers, the initial numbers that we have, the 15 millions and so on, may have been inflated. The other thing I wanted to, in the books, in geography, I did not mention was the women